Hello, and welcome to another episode of Northstar Talks Politics. Now, today I wanted to talk about a few concepts. I've got some Wikipedia articles up here that relate to some of these topics so that some of you can see bits of it, see what the articles look like, perhaps be inspired to read up more on some of these things yourselves. Wikipedia is, of course, a starter resource. It is not. It is not an all-inclusive resource, and not how you should start. I mean, and end your journey. You should start with Wikipedia, perhaps sometimes, but you need to read further into any subject. After all, it can be edited by anyone. Some of the information isn't always accurate. Anyways, what got me thinking, and what I wanted first to talk about here, is the concept of alienation. I'm sure that some of you have had the experience when you were at work that you kind of turn your brain off to get through the day. A lot of people seem to do that, and I was thinking about how that relates specifically to a lot of people losing their youthfulness surprisingly early in life, especially if they work the same repeating 9-to-5 job as one they don't like very much. Personally, I've been someone who moved through a number of jobs thanks to moving around the country and going back to school and trying very hard to get somewhere where I could become a physician in life, and struggles to do with poverty trapping me in a rural area at one point, and various things beyond my control. But that led to not doing the same job day in, day out, over and over and over, which didn't really affect me with this. But then I have increasingly noticed other individuals around my age, they've been so long, I think, going into the same job and turning their brain off, that they lose some of their vigor, their interest in life, their how would I say it? Their dreams slowly fade as they do this over and over. And that relates directly to alienation. In fact, let's get you guys the oh, come on. Well, this is social alienation. That's not the right one. Workplace. Wikipedia. Here. Wow, there's Marx's theory of alienation, but not quite the right thing. But it does relate to the concept. There is actually an element of social alienation as well. Of alienation. When you go to work, and this is the key thing, and this is what is the crux of the matter. You very often have no control over how your workplace is managed. Boss tells you what needs to be done and what he wants to be done, because what needs to be done is based on, well, the interests of the boss and the owners, and decisions are being made for their interests, their good, not yours. And you don't really get to object to that. If you don't like it, it's get out the door and go find another job. You can try to speak up, but it's not going to work. And if you cause too many issues, as I said, this differs drastically from something like a worker-managed business here, which, as Wikipedia says, an enterprise is self-managed is referred to as a labor-managed firm. Places where workers have say in how a business is run. If you think about it, if you came into work each day and there was no boss, and you and your fellow coworkers had to make decisions about how things were done, you wouldn't be able to turn your brain off. You would have to engage with what you're doing. It would keep things much more interesting, honestly. Maybe more stressful for some people because of the greater responsibility. But, greater responsibility, greater pay, because there isn't a boss who's doing all that and saying he deserves a much higher salary than the rest of you because he's doing the quote brain work and it's harder. No, you all have to collectively do that brain work, and the reward of that is you're all getting paid better. There's also no investors who are siphoning off money for doing nothing other than essentially lending money to the business, whether that's banks, business loans, or corporate bonds. These are individuals who have influence often on how businesses run, but don't do a smidge of work. All they do is contribute the money, the capital in socialist terms, or any economist terms for that matter, capitalist economist, socialist economist, anyone will use who's fluent in economics will use the term capital to refer to the wealth that is used to produce things. The investment capital, you've probably heard that term kicked around in capitalist circles. They love to phrase it that way instead of just capital, investment capital. Anyways, so if you had to make decisions, things would be more interesting. You'd have control over your own life in the workplace. You'd have to engage more. And of course, this relates to, and this is the next bit here, social ownership. There are different ways this can be done, but in something like a workers' cooperative, or a citizen ownership system, where you have public ownership, where you have even people who don't work at a business helping to influence how it's run, making decisions, because there are otherwise conflicts of interest between what's best for the people working in a business and greater society, just as there are conflicts of interest between what's best for the boss at a business or the investors and what's best for all the people working at a business as a whole. You get, I would say, more optimal decision making when the workers run the business, in that you're making decisions that are best for a greater number of people, that are incorporating. You can't have things that are externalizing costs. You can't have a boss doing something that hurts everyone else and helps him, but hurts everyone else more and it helps him. That's not going to happen with work cooperative, for instance, but there could still be the workers doing things that help them but hurt greater society even more, that wouldn't happen if you have a publicly managed business. Nonetheless, no matter exactly how it's done, if workers are engaging, if citizens are engaging, people don't just feel empowered, they have to think, and they feel in control of their lives, and that's important. I mean, people have influence, they have power, they feel respect for themselves, they feel they can change the world, they don't just give up on their dreams at a young age and become very jaded. And you didn't see enough of this in the Soviet Union. Things became much more top-down managed. That was partly because of the belief that experts should be making decisions. These were not people who had zero knowledge of things, like investors might not actually know the first thing about running a business. Often they were actually, the Soviet model more often correlated the equivalent of putting someone with a PhD in charge of making decisions of how businesses should be run. They were often people selected for experience and understanding, but there still became an element of greed and an element of alienation of the workers because they were not making the decisions in the workplace that they should have been making. This is not a failure of socialism, of course. This is a failure of one specific country. And one thing to keep in mind about history and about what happened with socialism is that there was one major locus of revolution, Soviet Union, that succeeded, and then it spawned satellite revolutions or transitions during the Cold War and the transitions to socialism in the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe after World War II that was specifically drawn up as spheres of influence, to the point that the Soviet government refused to support socialist movements in Greece because it was considered part of the Allied sphere of influence, but expected to have control over Poland, even though Poland would have much rather aligned with the West, for instance. So that was politics, and that was power politics. But the important thing to keep in mind here is that all the systems were kind of copy-paste of the Soviet Union and the Soviet system of doing things. So that's not really experimenting with all the different ways socialism can be done, saying, well, they all failed. Well, they're all identical. It's like, I've a lot of education on biology, graduate education on. If you have a bacterial colony, all the bacteria in that colony are genetically identical. Something that's a flaw in one of those bacteria is a flaw in every one of those bacteria around it. So if you're not going to see, like if there's susceptibility to a particular antibiotic in a bacterial colony, the whole colony is going to die out. It's not just going to be one. That doesn't mean that all bacteria are vulnerable to that antibiotic. It just means that colony is, because they're all pretty much identical. And what you historically saw was basically one colony, one version of socialism that just copied itself, and then a slightly different version, you might be thought as a mutant colony, that rose in China. The Maoist form of socialism was substantially different from the Soviet one, and influenced to some degree socialist movements in Vietnam and North Korea, but North Korea was much more heavily influenced by the Soviet Union. So one, maybe two forms of socialism that really ever got the chance to exist. Burkina Faso and Chile did try to go their own paths of socialism, but they were almost immediately cooed by the West, with assassinations, literally, of high-ranking government officials and generals. The leader of Burkina Faso was murdered. Salvador Allende was overthrown in a CIA-backed coup on September 11th, 1970. What was it? 3? The first September 11th, before the one that we all think of. But that was a traumatic day in Chilean history, far before the U.S. got screwed up by its own tragedy. And that was the second time the CIA tried to do a coup in Chile, because the first failed because the military leadership, enough of them, said, no, this is unconstitutional, we won't do a coup. So the CIA found the key individuals. They used actually some computational modeling to figure out which individuals were the most important to things turning that way, and then they murdered them. They murdered the individuals who are key points in the kind of, you think of a node and web system of the military, who were the key decision makers that if you eliminated them will cause the military to decide differently. They found those individuals, they murdered them, they put even more money into propaganda, particularly to distributing things like leaflets in the military that were anti-socialist, and then they sponsored another coup, and this coup succeeded, and then we got Pinochet in Chile. So no systems ever got a chance to do anything other than China and the Soviet Union. Those were they were very similar, because Mao actually was inspired by anarcho-communist who came out of the Soviet Union, who had somewhat different ideas than people like Lenin and Stalin, but was still Leninist, and then he adapted his ideology in a way that actually was more similar to the Soviet ideology than that of this guy that inspired him. And then you get Marxist-Leninist Maoism is technically what Maoism is, and which is, it's still very similar. It's to the Marxist-Leninism that was practiced in the Soviet Union, but with real social ownership that's effective and doesn't degenerate, because there were flaws with the way the Soviet Union implemented things, no matter how noble their goals were. People have say over how their businesses are run, that they work at. Now this brings me to some of this about the Jaeger movement and the Freikorps and the Finnish Civil War. It was not an accident that there were so few socialist movements that arose. It's not like it's an unadvisable thing and people want to do it. Historically, there were a set of civil wars all across Eastern Europe when the Russian Civil War happened. Attempts to turn socialist that occurred to varying degrees of success in Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Romania. If I remember correctly, there was even an attempt in Czechoslovakia and it aborted at one in Poland. There were peasant uprisings, socialist uprisings all across Eastern Europe. And the Germans sent the Freikorps, who were brutal, murderous paramilitary forces, into Eastern Europe illegally in violation of international law. And they basically went, you can see this, the insignia of one of them right here. It's a skull and crossbones. That should tell you something. Good guys don't go around with skulls as their insignia. They were evil. And they murdered thousands and thousands and thousands of civilians. Even people were suspected of having anything to do with the socialists. For instance, it talks here at Wikipedia about they killed 3,000 people in Riga, which is the capital of Latvia, if I remember. Or was that Estonia? I believe Latvia. So talking about Latvian territory here. The Freikorps brutalized the Latvians and Estonians in order to suppress the socialist uprisings in these countries. And then on top of that, the Germans also took anti-socialists from places like Finland, and they brought them back to Germany, trained them to elite standards, and sent them back. So these civil wars weren't falling along the lines of how many people in the country supported one side versus another, where the industry or land ended up, which, interesting, in the Finnish Civil War, there were actually slightly more people. It gives estimates here, and of course it puts them about the same, but actually, historically, we know there were slightly more people who sided with the communists than the anti-communists in the Finnish Civil War, of the actual Finns. They had the numerical superiority, and they controlled the majority of the industry and the biggest cities in Finland initially. But although a lot of the rural areas further north were under control of the whites, so they had a minority of the land, but a majority of the people, the industry, they would have won their civil war if not for the Germans, the Poles, the Swedes, all sending elite brigades. And at that point, Estonia, which the Freikorps had already crushed the socialist uprising there, and then the reactionary, it was a very right-wing Estonian government that was put in place by the Germans, then proceeded to send volunteers to the Finnish Civil War to flip that civil war that was grinding on, to make sure that the communists didn't win there. But there were socialist uprisings all over, and they didn't fail because people didn't believe in them. They didn't fail because they were unpopular. They failed because the Germans came in and murdered a bunch of people, the imperialist Germans. Except it wasn't just the imperialist Germans. Some of this occurred after the Social Democrats had actually already taken power in Germany. Although I'm not sure how much control they had over these right-wing generals who had served under the Tsarist government, who were already in place. Could they have recalled them earlier? Because they were eventually recalled under pressure from the UK and such, so that the UK sent their own paramilitary forces to do essentially the same thing. And the US pressured, but then the UK, the US, Canada actually invaded the Soviet Union, or rather Russia, during the Russian Civil War. So it wasn't hardly because they didn't support sending elite military forces to try and put down communist uprisings. It was just that they wanted their people to do it so they would gain influence in the states that ruled afterwards. But these were not insignificant numbers of people. If you look here, 14,000 members of the Imperial German Army were involved in the Finnish Civil War, as well as 1,450 Jaegers, who were these elite troops who were trained in Germany, who were Finnish, but 1,737 members of the Polish Legion, 1,000 Swedish Brigade, versus the Red Guards, and 4 members of the Russian Imperial Army, but that was because Finland had been part of Russia. So these were just members of the military who sided with the Socialists. It's kind of actually disingenuous to break them up, since the White Guards included members of the Finnish military who sided against the Socialists. And actually, a lot of the most experienced generals in the Finnish Civil War on that side. The numerical superiority was actually with people who sided with the Socialists. They just didn't have the foreign support that the anti-socialists received. So it's no coincidence that history ended up the way it did. Just as it's no coincidence that there was coup after coup against socialist regimes during the Cold War, because the United States funded these. And this all comes back to the concepts of social ownership, worker self-management. These things haven't existed really, not because socialism fails to achieve them reliably, but because only one country ever managed to really overcome the immense pressures put by a capitalist world on socialist countries and establish this. And then here's the thing, because this isn't just socialism. I ain't come just to talk about socialism here. Because of this, and because of fear-mongering and socialism, worker self-management, which doesn't have to exist under socialism, it's possible to do under capitalism. Workers' cooperatives can exist under capitalism, as it even says here in the Wikipedia article, to a limited extent with private companies in the form of co-determination and worker representation on boards of directors. That's not quite what labor self-management is, but it's approaching it. These things, though, are the subject of fear-mongering. Oh, if we do this, we'll all turn into socialists. So people aren't even allowed to do it often under capitalism. This is nowhere more ingrained than places like the United States, where you have an entire party, the Republican Party, that constantly stirs up fear over socialism and communism without most of their base even knowing what these things really are. I can guarantee you 99% of Republicans have never read the Communist Manifesto, have never read a word by Marx, they've never read anything by any of the anarcho-socialists, who are entirely distinct from the Marxist tradition, many of them, have never read anything by a prominent social democrat. There's some idealistic socialist traditions that ended up becoming some of the basis for social democracy that they've not read anything by either. There are a lot of left-leaning ideologies, not just socialism, that embrace worker self-management, and they've been crushed through fear-mongering, through illegal and brutal suppression of civil rights, such as the Palmer raids. Which were carried out by President Woodrow Wilson in the United States, and were a violation of the U.S. Constitution, eventually ruled to be a violation, but not before large numbers of people were arrested, deported, and even more individuals, because the numbers that were actually arrested, it says 6,000 arrested. That's probably a low-end estimate. I've seen estimates that put it over 10,000, but far more people were bullied, intimidated, had their careers ruined without actually being arrested. This was a precursor to the McCarthy era, but there was the first Red Scare, and that was set off by Woodrow Wilson, um, who was, by the way, a suspected member of the Ku Klux Klan. Wilson was not a good guy. He also, in many ways, established the basis for U.S. empire. Not that Theodore Roosevelt was entirely innocent of that, with his creating the Grand American Fleet and pushing into places like Cuba and the Philippines. But Woodrow Wilson was the one who really set it up as official U.S. doctrine to, quote, force open the doors of trade and to basically establish a U.S. imperialist presence of corporations working hand in hand with the military in places as far-flung as Indonesia, China, where the U.S. partook in the unequal treaties and the violations of Chinese sovereignty, which are part of what led to the formation of the Communist Chinese Revolution, and to China going Maoist is partly anger over the West bullying and occupying parts of China, which some parts of which were only very recently returned, with Hong Kong. How does anyone think Hong Kong was under British rule? It's because the British came in and conquered it over 100 years ago. It's not that, I mean, what, British people came and set up a city in the middle of nowhere? No, they fought wars against China that were completely unprovoked, took land as their, quote, dues from those wars, and blamed the Chinese, often made the Chinese pay for having lost wars in which the Chinese were the ones being attacked, in both land and money. And that's how the British got their hands on Hong Kong. But Wilson, while he was, partaking this kind of stuff in Asia, at the same time, he was illegally rounding up, deporting in some cases, destroying the careers of, blacklisting left-wing people. He famously, it probably doesn't talk about it in this article because this isn't technically part of the Palmer raids, had the Postal Service stop delivering mail to many leftist magazines in the United States. All they were doing is exercising their First Amendment rights to free speech. But he didn't like the speech, so he had the post office stop delivering the mail. If they couldn't get bills, they couldn't pay their bills, they couldn't keep their doors open. They also were many instances of the FBI and police bullying people into stopping subscribing to these magazines. So this is a clear violation of civil rights, but civil rights are meaningless whenever a group threatens the power of the ruling class in the United States, because they just turn around and suspend those rights and then pretend they didn't do anything wrong, and there's never any consequences for the powerful who do these things, because it's rules for me, not for thee, when it comes to the U.S., which is long been a democracy with strong oligarchical elements, and these days isn't a democracy anymore at all. It's an oligarchy. If you think you still live in a democracy in the United States, you're delusional. It's an oligarchy controlled by billionaires, but it's slowly trended this way for a long time. This is just the end stage of a long degeneration of a republic into an oligarchy, which is pretty much the same form of government the Soviet Union had. It was supposed to be a sort of workers' democracy and ended up becoming an oligarchy in the end. The tendency of systems to generate into oligarchy is strong across all systems and all periods in human history, unfortunately. Despotism, dictatorships tend to turn to oligarchies as aristocracies undermine the power of a central ruler, and democracies do as a few individuals accumulate power unto themselves. Oligarchy is probably the most common form of government in human history. We love to focus on dictatorships and things that were officially dictatorships, like the pharaohs in ancient Egypt, but there have been far more oligarchies, like the Roman Empire, which was really more of an oligarchy than a actual empire for much of its history. And the various thalassocracies. I believe I'm saying the right term. Basically, merchant republics, whether in Venice or in Southeast Asia. There were actually a lot of these systems, and they were very clearly oligarchies. There were theocratic oligarchies throughout history. I'm getting on a tangent. The point being is next time you go into work, think about for a second the fact you have no say over how things are run more likely than not. I mean, it may vary, but unless things have changed drastically since I became disabled with long COVID, not a single job I've ever worked has given me any real say in decisions. And in fact, often decisions were shoved down my throat that were not in the interest of the people we were supposed to be serving. This was especially irksome when I worked as an EMT. The things that we were doing were sometimes that were forced on us were to maximize the profit of the company, not to best serve the people whose lives we were supposed to be saving in some cases. Things like staffing levels, how many units were on call any given time, how ordinary transports were handled. I mean, there were good principled people who pushed back against this, but there were bureaucrats at the top of the corporation, because corporate bureaucracy is just as present and real and often worse than government bureaucracy, who were always pushing the bottom line and undermining patient care. This was true in obviously more clearly profit-focused jobs I did. I don't want to name all, or I'd probably be easy for people to figure out who it was. And then I get harassed by random right-wingers or something. As will probably happen, this channel gets big enough anyways, because those people do not respect freedom of speech. Not say anyone is right wing, but there are individuals out there who bully and try and silence people on the left. You don't really see the inverse. Not that you may see people object when someone says something racist, sexist, etc., but you don't see an effort to silence people just because they say something right-leaning very often from the left, though it happens if someone's going really far right. Anyways, you don't have control over where you spend half your waking life. And as a result, people shut their brains down, and they get tired, and they get irritable, and they get cranky, and it's just not good for people's mental health. It's not good for what it means to be a member of a society, for a feeling of engagement, and it encourages a kind of thinking that leads to authoritarianism in the wider political sphere, because people get used to taking orders and not speaking up, and speaking up and feeling empowered are necessary for a democracy to function. Socialism actually is more compatible with democracy than capitalism ever was because of this. That may be that the Soviet Union had the worst possible form of socialism for coinciding with democracy, but as I've repeatedly said, that is not the only form of socialism that could have existed, that should have existed. It's the only one that survived because of incredible, violent oppression by the anti-socialists within most places that tried to ever form any kind of socialist reality. And there are examples of worker self-management even today. The Mondragon Corporation in the Basque Navarra region of Spain and France, for instance, is mostly on the Spanish side of that border. It is a large network of workers' cooperatives. It is the sixth largest company, I believe, in Spain. There are also actually thousands of workers' cooperatives spread across the United States and Western Europe. It's actually quite a bit more common than you would think. That's worker self-management. You don't actually see that many in Eastern Europe because there were a ton of them when the Soviet Union collapsed, and the West actually came in and actively destroyed them all and set up policies that made them hard to exist. But I do believe there are still a few holdouts here and there, um, even though there were originally far more in those areas than there ever were in Western Europe. But forced desocialization, forced privatization of companies and workers' cooperatives was a thing that happened. With some really right-wing people put in power through U.S. State Department CIA influence and after the fall of the Soviet Union. But you can still find workers' cooperatives anywhere in the world almost. Different levels of rarity, but they exist. There are alternatives, and they work. In fact, workers' cooperatives, long-term, outperform private capitalist enterprises by a small margin. We're talking like, in terms of long-term average growth rates, I think like 0.2% higher. Very small difference. But they do better. They do worse in boom economies, and bear bull, Wall Street bear, Wall Street bull metaphor. They in a bull economy, they don't grow as fast as private capitalist enterprises. But when there's a recession, they shrink less, or they manage to not shrink, or they even grow slowly. Partly because one thing that workers' cooperatives will often do is, instead of laying people off, everyone will take it to their salary. People are more comfortable with that because there isn't some boss at the top who's paying himself way more than everyone else, and people aren't worried that if they take it to their salaries, so their boss can just pay himself more. There's more trust in workers' cooperatives. But partly for this reason, and partly for many others, including when times get tough, everyone has an idea of how things can be changed to adapt to these tough times. Workers' cooperatives tend to be more innovative than standard capitalist enterprises. They do better in recessions, and so their long-term growth rate, which includes both companies shrinking when the economy is bad and growing when it's doing well, is actually better. They are more successful, and they have a higher long-term survival rate in many countries than capitalist enterprises. Depends on if the laws specifically attack workers' cooperatives. In some countries they do, and they have a lower survival rate, but that's because of hostile legal regimes that are trying to kill them, not because workers' cooperatives are worse. And they, in terms of raw economic performance, they do better. So it's a completely viable way to do things, even just by the numbers of, economic growth. But that shouldn't be the only standard we measure things by. If a system is comparable, or very, very, very slightly worse even, but is much better for human mental health, much better for the health of a democracy, then why shouldn't that be the system that we use everywhere? It's, there are trade-offs. You can't sell everything out to make the greatest possible amount of money. That is a sure path to societal self-destruction, and as we now know, the destruction of the planet. So, think about this. Next time you go to work, think about this. You could have more say in how things are done. You don't have any say in what is this doing to your mental health. Anyways, until next time, adieu. And take care of yourselves. Be kind to each other. May you always find a guiding star to lead you home.